Hello, and very much welcome everyone to today's webinar on scaling digital trade. This is a series of webinars which Enigio is conducting in order to drive industry engagement around digital trade. My name is Patrik Seckar, I'm CEO of Enigio, and we're going to talk about how public-private partnership are turning vision into reality. And I'm very excited to have a distinguished panel with us today. We have leaders from World Economic Forum, Asian Development Bank, and the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. We're going to explore in this session how public-private partnerships, so-called PPPs, are accelerating and can further accelerating digital trade. But I would like to start this session with turning to each of the panelists and give us an introduction of themselves, but also their organization and respective organizations' missions, the what, the how, the why. Let me start with Nitin Sharma from the World Economic Forum. Could you briefly introduce yourself and your organization?
Sure. Thank you, Patrick. It's great to be here. Hello, everyone. My name is Nitin Sharma. I lead the digital trade and venture work at the World Economic Forum. For those of you who are not familiar with the forum, WEF is a non-profit international organization headquartered in Geneva. And the mission of our organization is to improve the state of the world. We work across different areas and trade is one of them. In my work, I lead the Trade Tech Initiative, and particularly in the Trade Tech Initiative, my work involves bridging the gap between innovation and regulation, basically emerging tech and the global trade policy, with a particular emphasis on the regulatory sandboxes. Most recently, I have had the honor to design and lead the forum's first regulatory sandbox in collaboration with the government of the UAE. We worked with 8 tech solution providers from different parts of the world. Enigio was one of them, with 4 key regulators from the UAE, including the central bank. And we tested different solutions related to digital trade, like MLETR adoption, stable coins, digital identities, and the other areas of digital trade related to trade finance. At its core, my work is about helping turn innovation into trusted, scalable trade infrastructure and doing it through structured public-private collaborations like regulatory sandboxes. And I really look forward to this conversation. Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Nitin. Could you please continue? Oswald Kühler, Digital Trade Advisor on Asian Development Bank. I don't think you need much more of a presentation as a person, but please share with us.
Thank you, and thanks, Patrick, for the opportunity. It really is a privilege to be here. So my name is Oswald Kühler. Like Patrick said, I look after digital trade for the Asian Development Bank. For those of you not familiar with the Asian Development Bank, our core focus really is to help and achieve a prosperous, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable Asia Pacific, and really helping us move as many people as we can out of extreme poverty. So that's fundamentally the Northern Star of the actual bank. And when you think about the conversations we're having today, one of the key things that we did a while back was we did a report on the trade finance gap. I remember Alyssa DiCaprio was still a part of ADB at that point. And the initial report that we published showed that there was about a $1.5 trillion trade finance gap globally. And one of the hypotheses that we had was that digitizing trade will actually help and reduce that trade finance gap. I think, as Patrick is aware, that gap has now grown to about $2.5 trillion in about 6 or 7 years. And so there's an enormous opportunity for, I think, all of us to help unlock a lot of opportunity and potential to help many SMEs gain access to trade finance. So what does ADB do? About 5 years ago, we worked with Enterprise Singapore and a few other partners to establish the Digital Standards Initiative with the International Chamber of Commerce. The view was that if we could solve the standards side of the equation and the legislative changes required to digitize trade, that we would empower the world to ultimately digitize trade. And those have been our focus points. So we are actively engaged today, working with the International Chamber of Commerce's DSI initiative to try and accelerate a lot of that work in the standard space, accelerating work in the legislative reform space. We've learned a lot, Patrick, on that journey. I'm looking forward to touching on a few of those things today. And yeah, thanks for having us, Patrick.
Thank you, Oswald. Charlie, if I go to you.
Sure, thanks, Patrick, and thank you very much to Enigio for the opportunity for EBRD to participate in this conversation. So first off, EBRD, for those of you who don't know the organization, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, we have a similar mission statement to Asian Development Bank, being one of our important partners in the development banking landscape. Ultimately, it's to encourage inclusion in our countries of operation, and that stretches from Northern Africa all the way to Mongolia. Now, in terms of digitalization, EBRD's role, I think we mainly see ourselves probably in many respects similar to ADB and these large organizations as a trusted advisor of sorts. And I think it's only in the last 18 months where we've actually recognized that we've got some real strengths in cross-selling EBRD's various workstream programs in advancing digitalization. Our three teams which focus on digitalization is the Trade Facilitation Program. That's the program I'm on. I cover the Central Asia market on a transactional basis and also our digitalization initiatives. At the moment, we're looking to do various pilots with our partner banks who are our direct clients. But we also have a very important team, which is the Legal Transition Program. They're focused at the moment on aligning the various legislative bodies in, at the moment, Turkey, Egypt, and Morocco to align them with UNCITRAL's MLETR. But then we also have the SME finance and development team who are looking at working with corporates, SMEs, on topics such as digital product passports and traceability and identification in supply chains. So that's in a nutshell what we do. Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you, Charlie. Okay, we're going to move into part one of this session, and then we're going to drill down into why partnership matter now. And if I start with you, Nitin, and let's start from the start, why are public-private collaboration essential for advancing digital trade?
Sure. So as we all know that, trade is going digital, but no single player can make it happen alone. I think that's the fundamental truth driving today's conversation. So what is, the holding back the global adoption of digital trade is not lack of technology, it's the fragmentation, it's legal uncertainty, incompatible system interoperability problems, and a trust gap. So let's break it down. So on one hand, if we talk about the private sector, we have, the technology that is evolving at a very fast pace. We have emerging tech, and the private sector is investing so much into that. On the other hand, we have regulators whose job is to minimize the risk, need to ensure the consumer safety. So they may not, be able to catch up the speed at which the technology is evolving. So clearly there is a gap between the rate at which the tech is evolving and the rate at which the regulations are adapting to that, evolving technology. So it is very important to bridge that gap. And I think to bridge that gap, to align the public and private sector, it is very, very important for us to create those public-private partnership opportunities. Maybe I can give you like one easy example to understand this. For example, if we want to build an airport, so what we need? So primarily we need the technology. For example, we need an airplane, which is there, technology is there and it is working. We all know that. The second thing that we need is the highway, which in my mind is the regulation that will enable that technology to work. However, the most important thing that we need beyond the technology and the regulation is the alignment, and you can think of it as the air traffic controller that can that can align the legal, operational and technical aspect of how the technology is working, so that we can take off the plane safely and land it safely. So when these three things, they work together and not in parallel, only then we can have the full commercialization of the technology. And that is the essence of public-private partnership, to have the alignment and the trust between the innovation and the regulation, and to close that gap of how the technology is evaluating and how the regulations are adapting to that evolution of technology.
That was a very good description of the airplane and an airport and what's needed around it. It's more than just technology. It's more than just regulation. Everything needs to fit together. I will steal that one from you, Nitin. Oswald, building on Nitin's point here, what do you see as the biggest regulatory challenges in trying to align that public-private interests?
Yeah, so I think we all have a role to play in this process, and I'm gonna touch on 3 items, even though I think both us and people watching would probably argue there's a lot more. So the first one is when it actually comes to engaging various different governments around the world. I think that at the highest level, we have a lot of really great high-level business cases. Here's the G7 kind of value case. Here's the Commonwealth level value case. Here's the $2.5 trillion value case. But at the end of the day, when you engage any specific country, they want to understand, well, what does that actually mean for my economy? What is the actual value proposition for us? So one of the areas, Patrick, that I think organizations like ADB and EBRD and Afrexim and Islamic Development Bank, where we play, I think, an important part is, how do we help answer that question so that for those countries who are interested, because the big numbers kind of caught their interest, get sufficient evidence to actually go through processes to actually enact the change? And I think it's good that we play that role, as opposed to, let's say, the fintech or the tech community trying to do that on their own. I think we have a unique position where we can actually help do that. The second item I would also touch on is, at the end of the day, what we've also, I think, learned over the last 3 years is that it's not just about regulatory change. When we started our engagement with governments, the conversation was mostly around, we need the model law for electronic transferable records. Can you please enact it? And let's go through a process. Where we are today is a lot wiser. A few things. So firstly, in the legislative side, it's either the model law for electronic transferable records and e-commerce and e-signatures and potentially factoring. There's potentially a bundle of laws that are actually required to really get to the scaling point. Some countries already have the majority of them, some have none. And so like a true portfolio, really understanding what are those countries that are on the shorter term, kind of value extraction point, and which of those are going to require more time because more work is to be done. And then the second area is on the implementation side, Patrick, is really not just having a legislative conversation with governments, but actually saying, that business case that we just gave you, for you to actually achieve those numbers, the law alone is actually not going to do that. You need to also, in addition to a legislative change, you need to potentially modernize your border and customs processes. You potentially need to modernize your business registration processes. And those are public goods, similar to collateral registries, whatever. But in addition to that, again, it's not an either or, but an and. In addition to that is, how do we bring innovative companies, whether it's a D&I company or whatever, into that market and say, how do we bring the business community with the governmental community together to say, look, there's all these different innovative solutions that can piggyback off both some of the legislative changes or can already unlock value without any legislative changes. So how do we actually help facilitate adoption in that market? And I think that's kind of the Northern Star, at least for us, is let's help make that business case for change. Let's make sure that we're very clear on what the changes are. Is it one law? Is it multiple laws? Is it laws and infrastructure? And is it laws plus a public-private partnership where we bring in that fintech community and focus on unlocking value, both the value that doesn't require regulatory change and that requires regulatory change? Because at the end of the day, we all of the MDBs, I assume, we get measured ultimately on the outcome. And the outcome isn't just a law change. The outcome is actually, seeing more SMEs gain access to finance. And without implementation, we won't get there. So it's an evolution, if you will, from where we were 3 years ago to what we need to do today.
Thank you very much. And Charlie, if we take your experience on tying into what Oswald's saying, how do you see that development organization support and financing, which you also do, plays a role in smoothing over this regulatory fragmentation in digital trade in your markets?
Sure, yeah. I really like Nitin's analogy of the air traffic control. Because at the end of the day, fragmentation occurs when different verticals are siloed, right? And people aren't quite speaking the same language. To piggyback on Oswald's points with ADB and their mission and their role, I mentioned earlier, we're the trusted advisor. I think multilaterals have local expertise. They have great access to the public sector because that political sign-off, especially in emerging markets, is extremely important. If you're going to rejuvenate the customs side as well as doing MLETR. And we also have that trust, which Nitin also alluded to. So I think our experience has been challenging. The legal transition program, my colleagues have been working on this for maybe 2 years now. We've chosen geographies where we think the readiness is perhaps closer than others, also ones which are commercially important, such as Turkey and Morocco. But really, it's been a case of bringing together both the private sector and public sector under the same room, hosting events and making sure that everyone's aligned and doing things in parallel to make measurable progress. Because otherwise, it's very all well and good changing the law, but as Oswald says, if there's no implementation, then it quickly gets forgotten about. I also think that these governments, our experience has been that the more you're engaging with them, the more they expect to actually have a serious conversation with you. It's fine to have a theoretical conversation about the law change, but I think they're actually demanding more now from MDBs because they've got wise to the fact that digitalization is here to stay. It's no longer a PR exercise. We actually need to push the envelope out further, and it's now not enough to simply talk about it and say you're doing it. We're all aware of the fact that we will get measured against our performance beyond the regulation change, beyond the customs authorities changing.
Thank you, Charlie. And we saw a poll coming up here suddenly. Was it only me seeing it, or did you see it also? What is the biggest barrier to scaling digital trade in your organization today? Lack of internal buy-in, counterparty readiness, regulatory uncertainty, cost and resources. Other counterparty readiness stands out here as the most challenging barrier. Any comments to that, Oswald? I know that you've been addressing this topic.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, in one of my previous roles in life, I directly struggled with that. I was working for a really large mining firm, right? And you want to digitize trade because internally you can do the math. You can see the working capital reduction, you can see the demurrage cost reduction. There's a list of about 20 different reasons why, you know, a large corporate that operates internationally would want to do it. But then it gets to, you know, how do I convince my banks, my customers, their banks, and my carriers to fundamentally join my platform? And at the end of the day, even if I'm a really big mining firm, there's always someone bigger. Either I have a bigger customer who's, you know, in a position to push me onto their platform, and it creates fragmentation. And the industry has learned, unfortunately, you know, what the cost of that fragmentation is. And I think this is kind of where. And Patrick, I think you were part of the leadership team who kind of with ITFA started the DNI initiative, if I'm not mistaken. But that's kind of the northern star of something like DNI is how do you give a ecosystem the flexibility where different stakeholders in that ecosystem can select whichever option they want to select for their purposes, while still being able to, you know, execute digitally with their supply chain. And I think I saw recently, was it Cargo X and Enigio doing a transaction, and that's fundamentally it. Now, we haven't necessarily, and I think, again, coming back to the MDBs, I think as a part of that implementation conversation, I think one of the key things that we need to do is help people understand that some of these challenges that have been holding us back over the last 2 years are both being solved in a very mature way, and that, you know, that the regret cost of selecting the wrong vendor is becoming a less of an issue or a risk. I also know that the Fit Alliance with DCSA and BIMCO is also now, you know, working quite maturely on standards on things like bills of lading, as an example. So I would almost argue that if I have a look in like the next 5 years, 2030, I think a lot of these challenges are going to disappear. And that biggest driver for people saying I'm on the fence is ultimately going to be removed off the table. Now, does that mean people like myself and Charlie, the World Economic Forum and ICC don't have work to do? No, we actually have a lot of work to do, because the first thing we need to do is make sure that those standards scale, that we ultimately help remove some of the challenges still around interoperability on the standards, and we remove them very quickly. And finally, we engage a community that you know, that saw over the last years quite a few fintechs disappearing, and might be nervous about selection, and actually explain to them, you know, where we are today, and why today is a better time to actually digitize trade than potentially 2 years ago. What's your views, Patrick? I'm going to ask you questions.
No, I agree with you. I think we I look very positively that this barrier will disappear. And as you mentioned, you know, that this isolation, it's not a sustainable way, and collaboration, and that's why we're sitting here all together. Collaboration is the way forward, and interoperability, not only between, you know, different electronic trade document provider, but also with other parties in the trade chains. We have the compliance and doc checking engines, which provide a great deal of value. You know, we just need to get the ecosystem to work, which in order to take out that selection of supplier risk. So I'm with you. Nitin, if I ask you, was this surprising, or is it in line with what you see also when here?
Yes, I also agree with what Oswald mentioned. I think interoperability is a very critical element when we talk about, you know, scaling digital trade, because trade is inherently cross-border. And, you know, in my experience, what I have seen while working with different countries is, you know, even the regulations or the innovation, it is happening locally, but when things go cross border, so maybe a document that is being recognized in Singapore is not being recognized in other countries. So although they have the capacity, they have the technology, it's just that framework of interoperability between the two systems to connect and work together is not there. So it is very, very important to have this element if we would like to remove barriers in adopting digital trade.
Thank you. So we're going to move over to part number two and talk about the building blocks of successful collaboration. If we now agree on collaboration is the way forward, how can we do that on a successful, and I would also like to add a sustainable way. And I would like to start with you, Charlie, from your perspective, an EBRD. How will you help corporates and financial institutions to bridge that legal and tech gap to ensure a smoother transition to digital trade solutions?
Sure. So I'll start with my team, the trade facilitation program. We've got our annual meeting at the moment, and we had a digital panel yesterday where one of our Turkish FIs was on there, and they were complaining that sure the regulatory environment is important, but there's also a tech and a human perspective as well, which needs to be noted. And I think of our 130 partner banks, they're hungry to learn. So when we did that polling of the counterparty readiness, um, I'm not surprised. We have kind of two work streams in a way. We have our pilots where we're trying to do real live transactions with our five corner model using a digital negotiable instrument. But then how do we prepare that once the law is in place to accommodate DNIs? One thing we're discussing and we're about to launch hopefully in the summer is a TFP innovation lab. This is a fairly large undertaking in terms of EBRD funding. I'm sure Oswald's familiar with the funding structures and the amount of hoops you need to go through. But essentially, we want to create a ecosystem where innovative solutions such as Enigio and anyone else is able to connect with our partner banks, share knowledge, provide sandbox environments, because that's where our partner banks will actually be comfortable, and also the public authorities in these countries will become comfortable once the necessarily laws are in place. And being a facilitator of sorts. If we look to the legal side, I'm less familiar myself, having focused on transactions, but I think it comes hand in hand with what we do with the private sector. On the legal side, they're piggybacking off TFP's presence in the country. They're saying we have a well-established TFP program which has done thousands of transactions in your countries. They operate with the largest banks in your financial sector. Let us help you connect with them all under one roof, and assess your digital readiness, do surveys of the financial sector based on TFP's skills, and then also deliver some touch points on how to move forward on the legal and policy wording. Our SME team, there currently is a panel at our AM happening right now as we speak, which I was meaning to go to, but they are very focused on supply chains and how can we support corporates there. I think we have a big role to play in education, and our key area of focus is actually for EBRD, the middle corridor, and it's the modernization of supply chains from the Far East all the way into Europe and down through Africa. So it's looking at laws, it's looking at the EU laws on digital product passports, and making sure that even SMEs, all the way down to SMEs, which may find it typically quite challenging to educate themselves on these aspects, are well prepared so that they don't suffer and there isn't an increased digital gap or trade finance gap, their access to finance when these laws do come around.
Thank you, Charlie. And I'm glad that you are with us here, but you need to catch up with these SMEs because we need them to engage. They are key. So I'm going to turn to you, Nitin, and you mentioned that one of your mission is to bridge the gap between regulation and innovation. And how does an organization like World Economic Forum better, create a better alignment frameworks and technology innovation? And I'm also would like you to tell us about what was the biggest lesson learned from the sandbox web trade tech regulatory sandbox you mentioned initially, and
Sure.
yeah, how others can replicate its success is a question here. So if you could address both of them, it would be much appreciated.
Sure. Okay. So, first question: how the organizations, like WEF, facilitate, this kind of public-private partnership. So, I think we act in three ways. If I, categorize them into three categories. So, first is we act as conveners. So, we bring the right people into the room. From regulators to banks to startups, trade platforms, port operators, customs, as we did in the regulatory sandbox. And then we create a neutral space where they can design together and not in silos. Like in the trade tech sandbox, we had 4 regulators from the UAE and the 8 startups, and even these 8 startups were working with banks and port authorities and customs, as Enigio worked with different banks to create the real world evidence after testing. So this is our first job, to bring people together and to bring the right people together in one room. Second is, I think we act as translators. So often the biggest barrier is not lack of ideas, it's a lack of mutual understanding. So if the tech pilot might work, beautifully, but it or doesn't, mean much if the policymaker can't see how it fits into the legal framework. So we bridge that gap by turning, what we learned from that innovation exercise and translate it into policy language so that the regulators can efficiently learn and change the policies around that. So we do that. And the third thing is, we act as amplifier. So lessons that we learn from one exercise, for example through this sandbox, which we are going to publish in this July, and then we are going to share it with other countries or to anyone in an open manner, so that they don't have to reinvent the wheel and they can basically learn from what we have learned through this sandbox and build on that. So that's how we work. Now your second question, what is the biggest learning that we had in the sandbox? So apart from the policy recommendations around MLETR, stable coins, I think fundamentally what we learned through this exercise, and I think this is very similar to what Oswald and Charlie mentioned earlier, that for the private sector and the public sector, because they speak different languages and they have different objectives and they measure success in a different way. So maybe for the private sector it is to commercial scalability, or tech adoption, and for the regulators it's the implementation of law. But we need to go one step beyond that and come to a common ground and measure a common metric of success, which would be the outcome like Oswald mentioned, like maybe access to trade finance for the SMEs. And when we have that common objective, where then we can make private and public sector to work together to achieve that common objective. So through these exercises, we need to find that common ground, the common objective, the common outcome, where the public and private sector can work together. And I think that is the way that we can make these innovation exercises or sandboxes more successful, rather than just testing technologies.
What makes the public partnership successful?
Yeah, so So in short, the way I look at it, when you think about public-private partnerships, it's really three different stakeholders operating at three very different speeds, Patrick. So when you think about the fintechs, generally with a fintech, you innovate and you make changes and you can do stuff in the terms of weeks. When you think about the business community that we're engaging as a part of a public-private partnership activity, generally, that's in terms of almost quarters, where it's either, customer, vendor onboarding or, scheduling changes within the organization. And then generally, when you look at the government side of things, you're generally talking in terms of a year or two. So I think one of the key things for us to be successful when it comes to managing private public partnerships is making sure that we don't just focus on one country at a time. We need a portfolio of countries so that we can line them up in a way so that there's always something that the fintech and the tech community can do at any given point in time. So as some countries are taking a little bit longer to, for example, get some of either the legislative changes done or the business engagement, ensuring that they understand what the value proposition is, making sure that some of the other countries that are there that are more inclined to potentially make some changes in advance, that we accelerate some of the work that is required there. The second one is really, in my view, and I think this is also where things like the ICC and, for example, Charlie, the MDB working group that we're all busy, actively participating comes into play. Success is really, in my opinion, for everyone to do whatever their superpowers are. So what do I mean? So what the MDBs can do, we can coordinate, we can bring government, we can bring industry, we can bring fintechs all together to actually focus on challenges. We can articulate value cases, and we can actually guide change. But when you actually look, for example, again, at the tech community, they can actually solve specific problems. And I think that's also where a lot of this public-private partnership comes in. It's that partnership, knowing what each of you do well, coming together and actually just getting on with actually doing it. Now, have we done that a lot over the last, let's say, 5 years? No, I actually think we were very focused on really just the standard side, and we were focused on the legislative reform side. But I think going forward, what we'll see is more of these activities where we actually say, how do we work together with the business and the tech community, so that we not just do, like Charlie also said, we're all ultimately measured on, not just getting a law passed, but the actual value that is being extracted in the market. And to achieve that, we do need partnerships where we do bring technology partners along the journey. I mean, if you have a look at some of the work ADB has done with GoAML, that's a good example. Again, we're not a tech firm, but there's some great technology out there, and we can get some really interesting results. And I think we need to do more of that in order for us to be successful. And the final thing I'll say, Patrick, kind of coming back to some of the work that you're doing, there's a lot of the innovation, for example, that you guys are doing where you don't actually need a legislative change to show value. And I think that's also one of the key things we need to consider. If I work at a corporate and I go to a CFO and I say, can I please have money for the next 5 years to do a project? And the only point at which you'll be able to measure value is at year 5, most CFOs will say no. If I go to a CFO and say, look, I want to do a project over the next 5 years, and here's the different value propositions that you'll see in year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, all building on top of each other, and you can actually measure the journey over 5 years' time, my success is far greater. And I think it's the same when we think about, some of these bigger programs that we do in country. There are some document types that we can digitize today without the model law for electronic transferable records that are valuable, that we can do right now, and we should do right now to start showing value. There are private law-based solutions that people can use in countries where they don't yet have the model law to get some value out of EBL adoption. Can they scale to 100%? No. But is that 2, 3, 4% valuable? Yes. And by the time the private law, by the time the regulations do change and evolve, that 2, 3, 4% can become 80%. So I think that's also something, Charlie, in my view, that we need to do, is go and say, how do we actually extract value for every year on the journey, not just wait for year 5 and go and say there's going to be this beautiful value case, but it's only going to come in 5 years.
Good. That leads me into, how do we turn this cooperation into impact? How do we? Let's talk about let's talk about scaling. And you touched on one real world example, but turning to all of you, could you share some real world examples where you think PPP or private public partnership helped the acceleration or moved the development in your opinion? I turn to all of you, so it's...
I'm happy to start. I think a good example for EBRD is the legal reform work we're doing. Let's take Morocco as an example. And the reason why I take Morocco is because I really like the work which our legal transition colleagues have been doing in continuous steps. To Oswald's point, it shouldn't be, here's a 5-year deliverable. You're never going to get to the top of the mountain if, you're taking a giant step and then stopping for several months. And it's to the same point about counterparty readiness. I'm involved in pilots. And sometimes it can feel that we take one giant step and then don't do anything for 6 months. So with Morocco, they started engaging with the authorities in 2024, and they partnered with ICC Morocco and UNCITRAL as well. In February this year, they launched a consultation with the public and private sector that involved a full-scale event. Now they're ironing out the survey to distribute both around the private and public sector. Those findings will be published in July of this year. That will involve another private and public sector event where the findings are shared. This is being done in partnership with the trade finance consultancy. And I think this is, in terms of being measured on your impact, when we seek funding for our technical capacity building projects, we need to plan this all out before we actually initiate the program. So it creates a clear roadmap of what is going well, what perhaps hasn't worked so well, or what could be done differently when they next do it in Egypt, let's say. But it also involves a lot of learnings from the engagement you have with the public and the private along the way. So I would use Morocco as our example.
Thank you. Nitin, do you want to
Sure. So
tell us about
I
some
would like
examples?
to highlight the impact of the sandbox, the first cohort that we did. So if I talk about the impact, so I think for the private sector or for the tech companies that we worked with in the sandbox, it gave them an opportunity to engage early with the regulators and seek their feedback to maybe change their product strategy, or maybe build their product more interoperable. So I have seen companies changing or having that feedback and incorporating that feedback to change that product timely, rather than they go live in the market and then there are some regulatory restrictions. So it was a very good opportunity for them to have that feedback early. And also I think for the public sector, for the regulators, it was a learning opportunity for them, that how the technology works, what are the risk implications, and how they can de-risk it or share the risk. So it gave them the learning opportunity to test the technologies with the real world data. And the third most important element was the counterparty aspect. So with these 8 companies, so there were like different banks, customs and port authorities. They were working, in the sandbox. So there are like less risk of testing a technology in the sandbox rather than, working with that company. So it also gave them the confidence that these technologies work. What is the evidence there? What are the risks? So it kind of, I think it would drive the adoption of digital trade and it would lower the adoption barriers. So these were the kind of, high level impact that a project, that a structured project like Sandbox, which is a prime example of public-private partnership created. Thanks.
Thanks, Nitin. I'm going to jump a bit here and going on to call to action. And that means, what can we do today? And I would like to start with you, Oswald, on, what should governments and regulators prioritize now to speed up adoption of digital trade and make transition smoother for everyone involved?
Yeah, so I think it's both governments and organizations like the ICC chambers in each country. And my view is it's both the regulatory change, but it's also having conversations on the business registry, the customs and border agencies, and also, Patrick, we seem to forget that most governments spend through procurement processes with smaller businesses as their suppliers more money than just about any global company on the planet. I think the UK spends about 300 billion pounds every single year. And so it's reminding governments also that they can help facilitate this change by also leveraging digital trade and their procurement processes with their suppliers. And a lot of those suppliers might actually also go to financial institutions and use some financial products to actually help with working capital. So for me, the short-term opportunity really is working with each of the chambers in each of the countries, and sometimes alongside ADB, sometimes alongside EBRD, sometimes alongside, Frexim Bank, to really lay out that framework and actually ensure that that works. The second one is also transitioning off the theoretical. Here's a white paper, here's a report, here's a website that has some number, but actually show people what the change will actually lead to. And I think there's nothing that beats a demo, in my view. It's one thing talking to people about what the future is going to look like. It's a completely different thing actually showing it to them. And whether that is, if I look at what CargoX did in Egypt, whether I look at the value that you guys produce, I think there's so many people like myself and Charlie and the rest of us are in such a beautiful position because there's a mature industry now where we can actually bring in partners to actually show governments this is what it's going to look like, show bankers. Now, the final thing, Patrick, and I think we touched on this also a little bit yesterday in a meeting the two of us had, was also, take the objections head on. There's a lot of objections, and we saw it in the very first poll. There's a lot of objections that we are all familiar with. We already kind of know what are the key things that are holding back, whether it's a bank, whether it's a government, whether it's a business. And instead of kind of trying to either ignore those objections or hope that the government official or the business isn't going to raise them, actually lead by listing, here's the objections that we know that people have. We know that, there's a key question on, am I selecting the wrong vendor? Is my bank going to accept the documents from this vendor? What's my carrier going to do? If I upgrade my border and customs processes, is this going to be compatible if I'm in the UK with the European Union? Is it going to be compatible with the ASEAN markets? My view is we need to actually embrace those questions and just answer them from the beginning, truthfully, because I think by doing that, we establish trust. So in short, whichever country, get the MDB involved, get the association involved, engage the business community, engage the actual government, demystify some of these core objections that they have, practically show them what the future is going to look like. The MDBs will support and helping build out the business cases for those governments, working with governments to really articulate the value. And then again, through public-private partnership, there's different things we can do. Some of us are really good at helping lead the legislative change, while others, if we work in partnership, are really good at working, with the business community or the financial services community in that country to practically show them what the value can be. And I think the final thing I'd say, and sorry for the long answer, is we need to not be scared of this concept of a proof of value. I know a lot of tech companies and fintechs go, but my solution is awesome. Everyone knows it's awesome. Why should I do a proof of value? I should just immediately go into production. The reason why most people want to do a proof of value is because they just want to see, I get the theory, I want to see in my own business context with my own stakeholders what the measurable value for me would be. And so I think if we're open to that and say, let's go into those, let's actually prove the value for the stakeholders who actually need to have that done. But at the same time, because we've addressed the objections in advance, build out that plan to scale. And again, just be honest about where can we scale and where can't we scale. So it's a really long answer, but it is because we're trying to digitize global trade. So it is a broader issue is how I would frame it.
Very good. And I need to tie into that because I think a lot of what you said, Oswald, came very clear when in WEF regulatory sandbox, where that collaboration with the parties where they were hands-on, that's helped building the business case, as you said, the proof of value. It's helped, demystify, getting the comfort. But it also broke down the barriers of my counterparties is not there, because you can invite your counterparties. So I think going tangible, probably to in a comfortable way, lead the market into scale is necessary. So as a tech company, I buy into it.
It's exciting. People get to see People get to see what the future could look like. It's not a 90-page business report that they have to read. Like, it's very difficult to get excited on a white paper, right?
Yeah, no, I agree. Nitin, if we look ahead then, what action can stakeholders take today to move from, sandbox or to mainstream adoption of digital trade solution? And what should be the first step?
Sure, I would keep it very short. I think, as Oswald mentioned, so both public and private sector have certain things to do. But I think for the public sector, I think regulators, they need to not just act as an observer, but act as a participant to co-create the solutions with the private sector to drive this digital trade adoption in a fast way. And for the public sector, my message would be, when you create the solution, take interoperability and inclusivity, these two things in mind, if you want to scale your solutions cross-border. So that would be my very short message for both the public and private sector.
And Charlie, to you, what's your advice on action to corporates and financial institutions to take now to stay ahead of the curve in terms of digitalizing trade?
I think the onus is on both sides. The corporates are clients of the financial institutions. My FI clients are my clients, and really, I think the uptake will depend on the demand. And I think demand is there, but perhaps there's a resource issue. So that means that people need to collaborate together. I liked Oswald's point, I'll keep it short, about people having different superpowers. And, corporates in some countries may have be better prepared than FIs. Then they need to educate the FIs. And similarly, FIs are the ones unlocking the capital for the SMEs and the corporates. They need to bring that knowledge to the corporates, and the MDBs are here to facilitate that.
Thank you. And please feel free to post questions in the public chat. I will try to pick them up. There's a little bit of difficulties because due to the technical problem, I think everyone sent in messages that they couldn't hear and see. So, but I will look out for them. But actually, we have one here which I would like to address, because you cannot leave a webinar these days if you haven't touched on the current geopolitical situation with trade tariffs and disturbance again on our supply chain. Everyone, please give me your thoughts around how will this affect trade digitalization? Short term, medium term, long term, your view. I can start with you.
Well, I think if the US keeps, the de minimis, the changes they've made to de minimis, it just creates another reason why we need to get off paper and go digital, because, the amount of content that, for example, their own customs and border systems are going to have to process is going to increase dramatically. And again, we don't know if this is the first, if this is potentially going to set a trend or not globally. And I think secondly, as organizations try and restructure or reorientate supply chains for risk mitigation purposes, I think digital just helps you do that more cheaply, more effectively, and more efficiently. And I think to the question that someone just posted, I saw a question on there like, what should people do? My view is, there's always safety in going to providers who's already digitized, clients. So if you're worried about the regulatory requirements, or you're worried about, your specific supply chain, there's a few organizations that have digitized trade processes, that have partnerships with banks, that have published, a lot of the work that they've done online on, Depesh's website. So my view would be go to those people, because they'll be able to actually help give you guidance on what you can and can't do. And they are trustworthy. That's the great thing about our industry. I think, Patrick, we're fairly lucky, because I think whether it's, ICE or CargoX or yourself, we have some really great leaders, in the market who can give people advice on what can be done currently and what can't yet be done.
Thank you. Nitin, from your perspective.
Sure. I think, whether we have tariffs or whether we don't have tariffs, but we still, if we talk about digital trade, we still have such a big opportunity to bring reforms, into converting paperless trade to, digital trade. So if there are tariffs, and if the tariffs are not there, we still have a problem to solve. We have the technology, and through, these platforms like public-private partnerships, the one thing that we can do our bit to address these challenges in the inefficiencies in the trade finance gap. Maybe we don't know what is going to happen tomorrow with tariffs, but at least what is in our hand, to solve the problems through this public-private partnership opportunities, we can do that bit.
Thank you. And Charlie, do you want to have a final word on what will this
summarized well? I think there's definitely opportunities. Yeah, I would guess that a lot of corporates are scratching their heads right now and struggling, and perhaps digitalization has maybe gone slightly lower down on their agenda and their list of priorities. But at the same time, this webinar is about public-private partnerships, and where problems arise, that's where people have frank and honest conversations, and you lean on your partners, and perhaps their solutions come out of the problems which we have to solve. So in the long term, definitely optimistic, and as Oswald and Nitin says, opportunities will be created for digitalization.
Thank you very much. We end with that. Digitalization is a train which will not stop. So I thank you all panelists. It's been a pleasure, and thank you for sharing your insights and also your views. Thank you very much. Stay tuned.